Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duelist video. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the World Championship and more specifically the World Championship qualifiers for Rush Duel Links. We talk about, I think, the pros, the cons, and why I am not planning to try and qualify for Worlds this year. So the first thing I want to talk about is the removal of the PvE portion from the GRF. Now, the World Championship qualifiers is not quite the same as the GRF, but they are very similar. They tend to follow the same kind of formula, and it's basically a copy-pasted event. And in the GRF, we did have a PvE portion for Stage 1, where in Stage 1, you could climb pretty much half the way up the ladder entirely by playing against PvE opponents, which was quite nice. Now, this was very good for a more casual style player that isn't really playing the game to play PvP, or the players that are speed players that come over to Rush to just get the rewards basically. I really did like this, and it being gone does kinda suck, but I do understand the removal in that it would feel a little bit less competitive if you didn't actually have to do a lot of PvP during the PvP event. So I understand it, I just think it's a little disappointing that it has disappeared. But Stage 1 is basically still free. It is very easy to gain points, and I don't actually know if you can lose ranks whilst you're climbing up to Stage 2. So, at least for me, it didn't take very long, just a couple hours of playing games pretty much casually, we managed to easily secure the second stage. Stage 2 does follow the same formula as the KC Cup, the GRF, and the Speed World Championship qualifiers, which I'm not the biggest fan of personally. This is basically a 72-hour ELO ladder grind, which in my opinion isn't great. I'm not a big fan of a scramble for the top 1 or 2 spots to qualify for Worlds. In my opinion, this feels a lot less competitive, and it does feel a lot more of, like we say, just kind of a mad scramble to see who can end up in the top spot at the end of a long, grueling ladder grind. I personally would prefer a tournament which decides who goes rather than a ladder personally, but that is always going to be down to personal preference. I would either like one massive event where you'd have thousands and thousands of people all signed up doing some sort of Swiss. It would almost be like a massive YCS sort of event, which I can understand why they wouldn't do that because that would be kind of a nightmare to organize. But maybe the top 132 on the ladder could play in some sort of Swiss or knockout tournament. I personally would prefer that, but I do understand why that would not happen. First off, any form of tournament is always going to be a bit of a hassle. You need judges and moderators for every little thing. We have a lot of community-run events right now, run by some really, really great people, but in almost all of those events, something goes wrong. Someone doesn't show up, someone disconnects, there's a bug so you can't play the game. Something always goes wrong, and generally you need some sort of moderator to sort out the problem. And if you have that on such a large scale, it does create issues in kind of the logistics of trying to run an event like that. So I do understand not wanting to do that. Not to mention that just trying to organize a large number of people in general is always going to be a bit of a pain. You have to set a date and time that works for people all in that region, get them all in, again, get all this work to help you do it. I completely understand why Konami won't do it, because you can basically run it all as a ladder system and not have to have anyone put any work in whatsoever, and it works kind of fine. You will still end up with a champion, it just feels a little bit of a mad scramble to see who that champion's actually going to be, rather than someone who's kind of overcome everyone else in their bracket and emerged victorious. Now, I think you could also make the argument though that a player that does make it through the 72-hour grind has to be someone that is truly invested, someone that's playing the correct deck, that has been winning consistently, that has been winning a lot, has been playing a ton, and therefore they kind of deserve the spot. And I think there is good merit to that argument. I do, however, think that the idea of trying to get players to play as much as they can in a 72-hour period is really not the greatest way to host an event like this. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the meta going into the World Championship qualifiers. So I have recently done a video talking all about the meta and my tier list and recommendations, and you should go and check that out for a more kind of robust overview of what's going on right now. But just a few things I do want to touch on is that I really do like the current meta, and I think Rush is in a great place competitively right now. I think we have a wide range of decks. I think it's quite diverse, even though, as you can see by this tier list, we do have Machine standing alone at the top. I do not think it is head and shoulders above everything else. It's just noticeably on a tier higher. So there is quite a lot of room for expression at the moment in the meta, which I think is always a good sign of a healthy meta. Now, Machine is probably going to be the most represented. This also means it's going to be my top recommendation, just because I do think it is the strongest deck right now. But also, Aggro, Cyburst, and Blue Eyes are fantastic picks. That's because none of these decks really have to rely on your opponent playing something specific. They don't have any particularly horrendous matchups, and all of them are relatively simple to play. So you don't have to really worry about the nuances of some of the more complicated lists. One of the biggest pieces of advice I could give is that you want to be flexible. You want to practice with multiple decks if you want to try and reach this top 10, top 2, top 1 spot and want to try and qualify for the World Championships. You need to be really astute with the meta in your current bracket and adapt to overcome any adversities that might crop up. And what that means is being able to change your deck, so edit it to put in some more useful text against what's currently being played in your bracket, or change your deck completely if it's being outshone by some of the other decks you're currently playing against, or if it has some particularly bad matchups into them. You need to be able to change your deck as the meta evolves and develops over the weekend, which is something that typically we do see. In these type of events where you do have so many games being played at such a high level because of the ELO system, generally if you're in, let's say, the top 100, you'll be playing against other people that are in the top 100, which means you should have very, very high quality games going on constantly. And when that happens in such a small space of time, the meta does tend to accelerate, which means it wouldn't be too surprising for it to evolve and drastically change over the weekend. An example of this could be that since machines are expected, players will tend to play cards like Combustion Crisis, just because if you're expecting to play against that deck a lot, why wouldn't you play a tech card that is really good into those decks? Now, there is some nuance to that, because some decks really don't care about Combustion Crisis, such as Harpies, a lot of maximum lists, they just don't care about it. So it will be a dead card in some matchups. So it was going to be, how many machines are there? How likely is it that you're going to keep running into these players? And as soon as you reach a high enough bracket, it should solidify the meta a little bit more, so you really have a good idea of what you can be playing against most of the time. A good example of this would be in the last GRF. As soon as I reached top 100, almost all of my games were against Hell Tuning Invasion and Overlord, so I only really needed to prepare my deck for those two matchups, as maybe 1 in 20 games I'd play against something that wasn't exactly one of those two decks, so I was able to tailor my deck specifically for those matchups, and it ended up working out really, really well for me. Combustion Crisis, though, is a bit of an odd card, because techs like that don't just stop machines, it's also really good into aggro. So because basically aggro gets hit as like collateral damage because of the rise of machines, and because aggro in general is quite a popular deck anyway, Cyburst and Blue Eyes might actually be the way to go, because a lot of the text that people include for those decks don't really do as much to Cyburst and Blue Eyes, which means those might end up being kind of the kings of this event. We'll have to wait and see. I would also say you want to play something that you know well, since you'll be playing the deck a lot and don't really want to burn out playing something brand new or something that does require a lot of brain power. You want something ideally that is second nature for you to play. That either means playing something complicated that you've played a lot so you know all of the lines, or playing just something that is very, very simple, which, to be fair in Rush, most of the decks are quite simple, right? There isn't a big jump in complexity from one deck to another, but there is enough of one that if you're playing a deck for 72 hours straight, you don't really want to spend the first 6-7 hours just learning how your deck actually operates and the nuances of what goes into winning specific matchups. So I have competed in 2 World Championship qualifiers for speed in the past, and for the most part, really didn't enjoy the experience. Now, I do have some fun and nostalgic memories of playing in those events, and obviously I was younger then, I had a lot more free time, it was a lot of more of a enjoyable kind of endurance race. But thinking back to it, it wasn't a great time. It was very stressful a lot of the time, and because of the way the format works, where it's 72-hour ladder, you're incentivized to play as much as possible and to a high level for long periods of time, which means less sleep, because less sleep means you get to play more games. It incentivizes bad eating habits because you really want food that you can kind of just pick up and eat, which incentivizes maybe ordering takeout or eating a lot of junk food, which is really not ideal. You want to still be treating your body with respect, right? You want to be eating healthily as much as you can, especially when you're going to be playing for 72 hours and be cooped up that entire time. To anyone that is going to push for top 10 or even top 2, really, I can't stress this enough, take care of yourself. Sort out your meals ahead of time rather than just eating junk food, right? You want to cook meals and maybe chill them, freeze them, and then just be able to reheat them easily later. It's not ideal, but it is a lot better than just ordering takeout for 3 nights. And the last thing I could say is try and get some good sleep. Although playing more is generally better for these type of events, if you are half asleep while playing, you are more likely to make mistakes, more likely to get cranky, maybe become irritable, and that can really start pushing you down into a tilt spiral, which is something you really want to avoid at all costs. So the last little thing I want to talk about is the fact that we don't have a ton of invitation spots available. Now this is a bit disappointing for me. So basically there are 8 total spots for Worlds, which is not really a lot. Now 2 for North America, 2 for Europe, 2 for Japan, 1 for Latin America / Caribbean, and 1 for Asia, Oceania, Middle East, Africa, which I do think is a little bit disappointing. I don't really understand why we have so few spots available. I don't know why it would hurt to take 16, 32, maybe even 64 players all the way out there. Now, on one hand, I do get it. If we are planning to reimburse the travel and accommodation for all these players, the more players you bring in, the more money it costs, which is really not great. But only having 8 players does make it feel a little bit less competitive. Obviously, you would like to see as many people as possible at this type of event, but from a logistics and monetary point of view, I do understand only wanting 8. It's just a bit of a disappointment. If you're from Latin America, Caribbean, only 1 player total from your region gets to go. I do think that is rather disappointing. Well, that's pretty much everything I have to say about Worlds itself. As for me, I realistically can't commit to playing Rush Duel Links for 72 hours. I have other commitments that require my attention, and I cannot just mash games constantly for that long. On top of the fact that I realistically don't even think I'm one of the 2 best players in Europe. Now, could I possibly qualify if I really pushed for it? I mean, maybe, but I think anyone could if they just really applied themselves and played the game a ton. Realistically, I think putting all that time and effort in for a chance to maybe make it when I know there are other fantastic players in Europe just doesn't seem like a good use of my time. I still plan to play in the event, I still plan to have a ton of fun, because even when the GRF came around, and again, I'm not a big fan of the format, I still had an absolute blast playing, and that meta was kind of garbage. It was HTI Overlord format, which realistically was not a great time for Rush, and I still managed to have an absolutely fantastic time playing in that event, so I expect the exact same from this event. I'm going to jam some noodles, probably going to play some Cyburst, maybe some machines, and just have just a whale of a time and really enjoy myself, because that's what I think the biggest takeaway should be. If you're planning to try to qualify for Worlds, I really do wish you the best, but as for me, I'm just going to play casually, have a great time, and really walk away hopefully with a big smile on my face. So thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.